Sometimes life strips away everything you thought mattered, leaving you standing in the ruins, wondering if you have the strength to rebuild. Xavier Robinson knew this feeling well as he stared at the broken-down gas station his estranged father had left him in the middle of nowhere, Texas. At 58, he'd already buried his dreams once. Now he was raising his two granddaughters, Ella and Elizabeth, in a place the whole town called worthless junk. The locals laughed when they saw him trying to fix the old pumps and patch the roof. What they didn't know was that beneath the cracked concrete and faded paint lay secrets worth $111 million. Hidden documents told the story of a forgotten black inventor whose oil fortune had been stolen and buried for decades. When Xavier finally uncovered the truth, the money changed everything. But wealth brought new problems he never expected, especially with young Ella, who started believing she deserved more than gratitude and respect. What happens when the blessing you prayed for becomes the hardest test of all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The West Texas heat shimmered off the cracked asphalt like broken promises, distorting the horizon into wavering mirages that reminded Xavier Robinson of every hope that had ever slipped through his fingers. He stood in the shadow of the rusted canopy that had once sheltered customers at Robinson's Fill-Up, watching his 10-year-old granddaughter Ella trace patterns in the dust with a stick while 8-year-old Elizabeth sat quietly on the concrete steps, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit named Mr. Buttons. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral. 3 weeks since Xavier had learned that his father, Ernest Robinson, had left him this derelict gas station in the town of Millbrook. Texas population 847 and shrinking. The old man had been as stubborn in death as he'd been in life, refusing to explain why he'd never sold the property or why he'd insisted on living alone in the attached house that now sagged like a tired old dog in the desert sun. Xavier pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his forehead. At 58, he carried the weight of too many disappointments in his shoulders, but his eyes still held the quiet dignity that had carried him through 30 years of steady work at the Dallas packaging plant until the layoffs came. That dignity had sustained him through his daughter Keisha's battle with addiction, through the nights when she'd disappeared for weeks at a time, leaving him to explain to two confused little girls why Mommy couldn't come home. The girls didn't know the whole truth yet. They knew their mother was sick and needed to get better, but they didn't understand that Keisha was in her 3rd stint at rehab, that the courts had finally granted Xavier custody, or that he'd spent his entire savings on lawyers and treatment centers. They only knew that Grandpa was their anchor now, and that anchor had dragged them to this forgotten corner of Texas where the nearest Walmart was 40 miles away and the McDonald's had closed down 2 years ago. Grandpa, Ella said, looking up from her dust drawings, when are we going home? Xavier's chest tightened. Home was a 2-bedroom apartment in Dallas that he could no longer afford. Home was a life that no longer existed. This is home now, baby girl, he said gently. We're going to make something good here. Ella wrinkled her nose. But there's nothing here. No friends, no school, no nothing. There's us, Xavier replied. Sometimes that's enough to start with. Elizabeth spoke for the first time that morning, her voice barely above a whisper. I like the quiet. Xavier smiled at his younger granddaughter. Elizabeth had always been sensitive to chaos, and the past year of Keisha's relapses had left her jumpy and withdrawn. Maybe the stillness of this place would be good for her, even if it felt like exile to the rest of them. The sound of a pickup truck approaching made all 3 of them turn. A dusty Ford pulled up to the pumps, and a weathered woman in her 50s climbed out. She wore jeans and a faded blue shirt with Katie's Kitchen embroidered on the pocket, and her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. You must be Ernest's boy, she said, extending a calloused hand. I'm Katie Harrison. I run the diner in town. Xavier shook her hand, grateful for the first friendly gesture he'd received since arriving. Xavier Robinson. These are my granddaughters, Ella and Elizabeth. Katie knelt down to the girl's level. Well, aren't you two pretty as pictures? I bet you're hungry after all that traveling and settling in. We had cereal for breakfast, Ella announced. From a box. Grandpa doesn't know how to make pancakes. Ella, Xavier warned gently, but Katie laughed. Nothing wrong with cereal, honey. But if you want pancakes, you come see me at the diner. Best pancakes in 3 counties. She stood and looked around the property with knowing eyes. Your daddy was a proud man. Stubborn as a mule, but proud. Did you know him well? Xavier asked. Well enough. He came into the diner every Tuesday for 20 years, ordered the same thing, coffee black, eggs over easy, wheat toast. Never said much, but he always asked about my granddaughter in college. Katie's expression softened. He talked about you sometimes. Said you were doing good in Dallas, raising those girls right. Xavier felt a familiar ache in his chest. His father had never said those words to him directly. Their relationship had been cordial but distant, marked by years of misunderstanding and stubborn silence. Ernest had disapproved of Kaisha's wild streak, had blamed Xavier for being too permissive. The old man had never understood that love sometimes meant holding on loosely, hoping your child would find their way back. He left me this place, Xavier said, gesturing at the decrepit station. I'm not sure what he expected me to do with it. Katie's eyes held a flicker of something, knowledge, maybe, or caution. Ernest always said this land was special. More than meets the eye, he'd say. Course, folks around here just figured he was talking nonsense. But your daddy wasn't a nonsense kind of man. Before Xavier could ask what she meant, another vehicle pulled up, a beat-up Chevy with a loud muffler and primer spots along the doors. A black man about Xavier's age climbed out, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He had the build of someone who'd worked with his hands his whole life, and his expression carried the wariness of a man who'd learned to be careful about showing kindness to strangers. Malik Johnson, he said, nodding to Xavier. I run the garage down the road. Heard Ernest's son was in town, Xavier Robinson. They shook hands, and Malik glanced around the property with the practiced eye of someone who understood machinery. These old pumps might work if you can find parts. Haven't made this model since the 70s, but I might have some pieces in my junkyard. I appreciate that, Xavier said, though I'm not sure I'll be reopening for business. Might want to, Malik said. Nearest gas is 20 miles either direction. Folks around here would be grateful for the convenience, even if they don't act like it at first. Katie shot Malik a look. Speaking of folks not acting grateful, has Roy Hutchins been by yet? Xavier frowned. Who's Roy Hutchins? Town council president, Malik explained. Owns the hardware store and thinks he owns half the county. He's got opinions about everything, especially about property that's been sitting empty. What kind of opinions? The kind that usually involve eminent domain and development deals with his cousin, who's a real estate developer in Midland. Katie said dryly. Xavier felt a knot forming in his stomach. The last thing he needed was local politics complicating an already difficult situation. The property's paid for. My father owned it free and clear. That's what Ernest always said. Malik nodded. But Roy's been circling this place like a buzzard for years. Now that the old man's gone, he shrugged. Elizabeth tugged on Xavier's hand. Grandpa, I'm hot. Let's get you inside, Xavier said, then looked at his visitors. Would you like to come in? I can't offer much, but I've got cold water and some crackers. Katie and Malik exchanged a glance. We should get going, Katie said. But Xavier, if you need anything at all, you come see me at the diner. And don't let Roy Hutchins bully you. This land belongs to you and these girls now. After they left, Xavier led his granddaughters into the house attached to the back of the gas station. The interior was dim and stuffy, filled with the accumulated clutter of 20 years of solitary living. His father had been a collector of newspapers, magazines, and mechanical odds and ends. Stacks of National Geographic reached nearly to the ceiling in one corner, while boxes of old car parts and tools filled another. "It smells like old people," Ella complained. "It smells like history," Xavier corrected gently. "Your great-grandfather lived here for a long time. These are his things, his memories." Elizabeth wandered over to a bookshelf lined with leather-bound volumes and picked up a thick journal with a cracked cover. "What's this, Grandpa?" Xavier took the journal from her hands and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with his father's careful handwriting dates, observations, and what looked like financial calculations. On the first page, in Ernest's distinctive script, were the words, "For Xavier, the truth about the deal. Look beneath what seems broken. It's your great-grandfather's journal," Xavier said. His voice hushed. He wrote down his thoughts and memories. "What kind of thoughts?" Ella asked, suddenly interested. Xavier flipped through a few pages, seeing references to oil companies, legal documents, and a name he didn't recognize. Thaddeus Washington. "I'm not sure yet, baby girl. But maybe it'll help us understand why he loved this place so much." That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep on air mattresses in what had been Ernest's bedroom, Xavier sat at the kitchen table under a bare light bulb, reading his father's journal. The entries went back 20 years, documenting everything from weather patterns to visits from strangers asking questions about the property. But scattered throughout were cryptic references to the Washington business and making it right. On a page dated just 6 months before Ernest's death, Xavier found an entry that made his hands tremble. "Xavier will come here eventually. The girls will need stability, and Kaisha's demons won't be conquered easily. When he finds what I've hidden, he'll understand why I never sold. Some debts can only be paid by the next generation. The truth is under the loose board by the east window. Tell him to look for the blueprints. Tell him Thaddeus Washington deserves justice, even if it comes 100 years late." Xavier closed the journal and looked around the cluttered room with new eyes. His father hadn't just left him a rundown gas station. He'd left him a mystery, and possibly something much more valuable than the decrepit building suggested. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the gaps in the siding, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of secrets waiting to be uncovered. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Xavier Robinson felt a flicker of hope. Maybe his father's final gift wasn't abandonment after all. Maybe it was opportunity. He just had to be brave enough to look beneath what seemed broken. Asterisk. The loose floorboard by the east window creaked like an old man's bones every time Elizabeth walked past it. For 3 days, Xavier had noticed the sound but dismissed it as just another sign of the house's decay. But his father's journal entry kept echoing in his mind. The truth is under the loose board by the east window. It was Thursday morning when curiosity finally overcame caution. The girls were outside, Ella attempting to teach Elizabeth how to skip stones in the dried-up creek bed behind the station, their laughter drifting through the open windows like a balm for Xavier's worried soul. He knelt beside the window and ran his fingers along the floorboards until he found the one that gave. Slightly under pressure, the board lifted easier than he'd expected, revealing a space that had been carefully hollowed out between the floor joists. Inside lay a metal box, the kind used for important documents, wrapped in an oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and time. Xavier's heart hammered against his ribs as he lifted the box and set it on the kitchen table. The lock had long since rusted away. Inside, Xavier found treasures that would have meant nothing to most people but felt like pure gold in his hands. Blueprints rolled tight and bound with rubber bands. Legal documents yellowed with age, and a collection of photographs showing black men in work clothes standing beside massive drilling equipment. The blueprints were dated 1947 and bore the name Thaddeus Washington in elegant script across the bottom. They detailed oil drilling techniques that looked far more sophisticated than anything Xavier had seen from that era revolutionary. designs for extraction pumps, pipeline systems, and refinery processes that seemed decades ahead of their time. But it was the legal documents that made Xavier's hands shake. Contract after contract, all bearing Washington's signature alongside names Xavier didn't recognize. Hutchins Petroleum Development, Millbrook Land Holdings, and West Texas Extraction Company. The papers told a story of partnership agreements, patent applications, and royalty deals that should have made Thaddeus Washington a wealthy man. Instead, Xavier found transfer documents dated just 2 years later in 1949, showing all of Washington's rights and patents signed over to his white business partners for what the papers called consideration of debts owed. The signatures looked rushed, desperate, and at the bottom of one document was a handwritten note in different ink. T.W. forced to sign under duress. See Sheriff's Report, April 5, 1049. E.R. Ernest Robinson. Xavier's father had been documenting evidence of what looked like fraud or coercion, something that had happened 30 years before Xavier was even born. The photographs provided faces to go with the names. Thaddeus Washington was a tall, dignified man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands, often shown explaining his drilling innovations to groups of white investors who looked skeptical even as they studied his blueprints. In one photo, Washington stood beside a much younger Ernest Robinson, both men smiling at the camera with the easy camaraderie of friendship. Xavier was so absorbed in the documents that he didn't hear the girls come inside until Ella's voice broke through his. "Concentration. Grandpa, what's all that old stuff?" Xavier looked up to find both granddaughters staring at the scattered papers with curiosity. Elizabeth's eyes were wide, but Ella wore the expression of someone who discovered buried treasure. "It's history," Xavier said carefully. "Your great-grandfather kept some papers about a man named Thaddeus Washington. Was he famous?" Ella asked, leaning over the table to examine the blueprint. "He should have been," Xavier replied. "He invented some amazing things, but it looks like he never got the credit he deserved." Elizabeth picked up one of the photographs. "Is that great-grandpa Ernest?" Xavier nodded. "When he was young, probably not much older than your mother is now. He looks happy," Elizabeth observed softly. "I think he was, back then," Xavier agreed. Before life got complicated. That afternoon, Xavier drove into town with the girls, ostensibly to buy groceries, but really to see Katie Harrison. If anyone would know about local history involving Thaddeus Washington, it would be someone who'd lived in Millbrook her whole life. Katie's kitchen occupied a narrow building on Main Street between a closed-down pharmacy and a barber shop that looked like it hadn't updated its prices since 1975. The diner was exactly what Xavier had expected. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered linoleum, and the smell of bacon grease and coffee that had soaked into the walls over decades. Well, look who decided to venture into civilization. Katie called from behind the counter as they entered. "You girls hungry for those pancakes I promised." Ella and Elizabeth slid into a booth while Xavier approached the counter. The lunch crowd consisted of 3 elderly men playing dominoes in the corner and a woman with a crying baby who looked grateful for the distraction when the girls waved at her infant. "Katie," Xavier said quietly, "I need to ask you about something. Do you remember anyone named Thaddeus Washington?" Katie's coffee pot stopped mid-pour. She set it down carefully and gave Xavier a long look. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found some papers in my father's house. Old documents from the 1940s. It looks like this Washington fellow was some kind of inventor." "Lord have mercy," Katie whispered. She glanced around the diner, then came around the counter. "Girls, you want to play the jukebox? I've got quarters." She handed Ella some coins and waited until both girls were distracted by the ancient Wurlitzer in the corner. "Sit down," Katie told Xavier, sliding into the booth across from him. Thaddeus Washington is a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in probably 15 years. But my grandmother used to tell stories. What kind of stories? The kind that'll break your heart if you let them, Katie said. According to Grandma Ruth, Washington was the smartest man in 3 counties. Had ideas about oil drilling that were so advanced, the big companies came calling from Houston and Midland. This was right after the war, when everyone was desperate to find new oil fields. Xavier leaned forward. What happened to him? Same thing that happened to a lot of black folks back then who got too successful too fast, Katie said bitterly. The white businessmen he partnered with decided they didn't need a partner anymore. Grandma Ruth said there were accusations, stealing equipment, falsifying documents, things that were clearly made up but enough to scare a black man in 1949. Texas. The papers I found suggest he was forced to sign over his patents. Katie nodded grimly. Grandma Ruth always said he had no choice. Sign everything over or face charges that would have put him in prison for years. Maybe worse. You have to understand, Xavier, this was a different time. A black man's word against white businessmen? There was no justice in that fight. What happened to Washington after that? Nobody knows for sure. He disappeared from Millbrook right after he signed those papers. Some say he went north. Others think he just couldn't bear to stay and watch other men get rich off his ideas. Katie's eyes grew distant. Grandma Ruth kept some of his letters, though. Said someday the truth would come out and somebody would make it right. Xavier's pulse quickened. Letters? Personal correspondence. Things Washington wrote to his friends here before he left town. I've got them in a box at home, never knew what to do with them. Katie studied Xavier's face. You thinking what I think you're thinking. I'm thinking maybe my father found something that could prove Washington was cheated. And maybe it's not too late to do something about it. From across the diner, Ella called out, Grandpa, this song is weird. It's all scratchy and old. That's because it's older than dirt. Honey, Katie called back, then turned to Xavier with a serious expression. You need to be careful, Xavier. There are people in this town who won't appreciate you digging up old business. Roy Hutchins, for one. His grandfather was one of the men who bought Washington's patents for pennies on the dollar. Are you saying the Hutchins family is still profiting from stolen technology? I'm saying that money builds on money, and guilt runs deep in some families. Roy spent 30 years trying to buy up land in this area, including your daddy's gas station. If there's proof that his family fortune was built on fraud, ... double quotes, Katie shrugged. Well, that's the kind of thing that could change everything. Xavier looked at his granddaughters, who were now examining the old photographs and movie posters on the diner's walls with the fascination of children discovering ancient artifacts. Ella was explaining to Elizabeth how jukeboxes worked, her voice filled with the confidence of someone who'd figured out the world's mysteries. I need to see those letters, Xavier said. Katie nodded slowly. I'll bring them by tomorrow. But Xavier, promise me you'll think carefully before you do anything with what you find. Sometimes the truth costs more than lies, especially when powerful people have been living comfortable with those lies for 70 years. That evening, as Xavier tucked the girls into their makeshift beds, Elizabeth looked up at him with solemn eyes. Grandpa, are we going to be okay here? Xavier smoothed her hair back from her forehead. What makes you ask that, sweetheart? I heard you and Miss Katie talking about important things, adult things. Usually when adults whisper about important things, it means something bad is going to happen. Xavier felt his heart clench. This little girl had learned too early to read the signs of impending change, to brace herself for the next crisis. Sometimes adults whisper because they're trying to solve problems, not because bad things are coming. I found some papers that belonged to a man who was treated unfairly a long time ago. Miss Katie and I are trying to figure out if we can help make things right. Like fixing something that's broken? Ella asked from her air mattress. Exactly like that, Xavier said. Sometimes the most important things to fix are the ones you can't see. After the girls fell asleep, Xavier returned to the kitchen table and spread out Thaddeus Washington's blueprints under the harsh light of the bare bulb. The designs were elegant and innovative, showing drilling techniques that wouldn't become standard practice for decades. This wasn't just a case of a man being cheated out of money. This was genius that had been stolen. Innovations that had shaped an entire industry while the inventor vanished into history. Outside, the desert wind continued its nightly song, but now it seemed to carry voices from the past. The voice of a brilliant man whose legacy had been buried along with the truth. Xavier Robinson stared at the evidence in front of him and realized that his father hadn't just left him a gas station. He'd left him a chance to rewrite history. The question was whether Xavier had the courage to take it. Asterisk. The Millbrook Public Library had seen better days. Half the fluorescent lights were burned out. The carpet bore stains from decades of small-town disasters. And most of the computers looked like they'd been donated during the Clinton administration. But it had what Xavier needed: microfiche records, old newspaper archives, and a librarian named Dorothy Chun, who treated every research request like a personal mission. 1947 to 1949. Dorothy mused, adjusting her reading glasses as she led Xavier and Ella to the microfiche machine. That was right around the time of the big oil boom in West Texas. What exactly are you looking for? Information about a man named Thaddeus Washington, Xavier said. He was an inventor, worked with oil drilling equipment. Dorothy's eyebrows rose. That's a name I haven't heard in years. Are you family? No, just curious about local history. Dorothy gave him a knowing look. I found that when people start getting curious about Thaddeus Washington, it's usually more than casual interest. Give me a few minutes. While Dorothy retrieved the appropriate microfiche reels, Ella examined the old newspaper headlines scrolling past on the viewer screen. Grandpa, why are all these pictures black and white? Because this was before color photography was common, Xavier explained. This machine shows us newspapers from when your great-grandfather was young. Everything looks so serious, Ella observed. And everybody's wearing hats. Different times, Xavier said. But he was thinking about the gravity in those old faces. The sense that people understood the weight of their actions in ways that seemed foreign. Now Dorothy returned with an armload of microfiche boxes. I pulled everything from 1945 to 1950. There's not a lot about Washington specifically black. Inventors didn't get much newspaper coverage back then, but there are articles about the oil boom and the companies that were operating in the area. For the next 2 hours, Xavier and Ella scrolled through decades of local history. They found birth announcements, obituaries, crop reports, and social news that painted a picture of a community that was racially divided but economically interdependent. Black families worked in the oil fields and ranches owned by white families, but they lived in different neighborhoods, went to different churches, and their children attended different schools. Then Ella, who had been surprisingly patient with the tedious search, pointed at the screen. Grandpa, look at that one. The headline read, Local Negro Inventor Patents New Drilling Technique. The article, dated March 15th, 1947, was only 3 paragraphs long, but it mentioned Thaddeus Washington by name and described his revolutionary approach to oil extraction that promises to increase efficiency by as much as 40%. That's him, Xavier breathed. Keep reading, baby girl. The article went on to explain that Washington had partnered with several local businessmen to form West Texas Extraction Company, with plans to implement his drilling innovations across the region. The final paragraph mentioned that investors from Houston have expressed significant interest in Washington's patents and the potential for expanded operations. He was famous, Ella said with wonder. At least a little bit. He should have been more famous. Xavier replied grimly. They found 2 more articles over the following months. both brief mentions of successful drilling operations using the Washington method. But then, in April 1949, the tone changed dramatically. Equipment theft alleged at local oil operation. Read the headline from April 18, 1949. The article described accusations against Thaddeus Washington for allegedly stealing company equipment and falsifying drilling reports. It mentioned that Washington had been questioned by local authorities and that his business partners were conducting a thorough investigation of all company assets. "This doesn't sound right," Ella said, reading over Xavier's shoulder with the intuition of a child who'd learned to recognize adult lies. "No, it doesn't," Xavier agreed. "What do you notice about the timing?" Ella studied the dates. "The good articles are from 1947, and the bad one is from 1949. That's 2 years." "Exactly. 2 years of successful operations. Then suddenly he's accused of theft right around the time my father's documents show Washington signing over all his patents." Dorothy had been listening from her desk nearby. "You might want to look at the property records from that time period," she suggested. "Those are public documents, and they show any transfers of land or mineral rights." "Where would I find those?" "County courthouse. But I can tell you right now, most of the mineral rights in this area ended up consolidated under a few companies by the 1950s. Hutchins Petroleum Development bought out most of the smaller operations." Xavier felt the pieces clicking together. "Hutchins is in Roy Hutchins? His grandfather started the company. Roy inherited it, along with considerable holdings throughout West Texas." Dorothy's voice carried a note of caution. "He's not someone who appreciates people digging into family business." That afternoon, Xavier left Ella at the library with Dorothy and drove to the courthouse in the county seat, 20 miles away. The property records were exactly what he'd expected. A paper trail showing how Thaddeus Washington's mineral rights and patents had been transferred to Hutchins Petroleum Development in 1949 for what the documents called settlement of debts and legal obligations. But Xavier also found something he hadn't expected: the original partnership agreement from 1947, filed with the county clerk and bearing all the signatures. According to this document, Washington hadn't just been an employee or contractor. He'd been a full partner in West Texas Extraction Company, entitled to 50% of all profits and royalties in perpetuity. The math was staggering. If Washington's drilling innovations had been as revolutionary as the early newspaper articles suggested, and if his patents had been the foundation for decades of oil extraction in West Texas, then the stolen fortune wasn't just significant. It was generational wealth that had been systematically siphoned away from its rightful owner. Xavier photocopied every relevant document, his hands shaking as he realized the magnitude of what his father had preserved. This wasn't just evidence of fraud. It was proof of one of the most successful thefts in Texas history, carried out in broad daylight with the cooperation of local law enforcement and business leaders. On the drive back to Millbrook, Xavier's phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed Katie's number. "Xavier, you need to get back here right now." Katie's voice was tight with urgency. "Roy Hutchins is at your place, and he's got a sheriff's deputy with him. They're talking to your girls." Xavier's blood turned to ice. "What?" "Elizabeth called the diner crying. Said men in uniforms were asking her questions about what you've been doing." "I'm heading over there now, but you need to hurry." Xavier pressed the accelerator harder, his mind racing. How had Roy Hutchins found out about his research so quickly? And what legal authority did he have to question the girls? By the time Xavier reached the gas station, a small crowd had gathered. Katie's pickup was parked next to a sheriff's cruiser and a black SUV with Hutchins Petroleum Development logos on the doors. He could see Ella and Elizabeth standing close together near the house, Elizabeth clutching Mr. Buttons while a uniformed deputy took notes on a clipboard. Roy Hutchins was exactly what Xavier had expected. A middle-aged white man with the soft build of someone who'd inherited his authority, wearing expensive boots and a Stetson that had probably never seen actual ranch work. He turned as Xavier approached, his smile containing no warmth whatsoever. "Mr. Robinson, I presume." "I'm Roy Hutchins. I think we need to have a conversation about some property matters." "I think you need to explain why you're questioning my granddaughters without my permission," Xavier replied, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made the deputy look uncomfortable. "Now, no need to get hostile," Hutchins said smoothly. "Deputy Martinez here was just asking the girls about some safety concerns regarding the property. Old gas stations can be dangerous places for children. What with all the underground storage tanks and potential environmental hazards." Xavier looked at the deputy, a young Hispanic man who seemed distinctly uncomfortable with the situation. "Deputy Martinez, I assume you have proper paperwork for any safety inspection?" "Well, no, sir," Martinez admitted. Mr. Hutchins called about concerns, but this was more of a welfare check. "On my granddaughters or my property?" "Both, I suppose." Katie stepped forward. "Roy, what's this really about?" "Xavier's been here less than a week." Hutchins' smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "It's about community responsibility, Katie. When someone inherits property with potential environmental issues, the community has a right to ensure proper safety measures are in place." Xavier studied the man's face and saw something beyond bureaucratic concern. He saw fear. "This wouldn't have anything to do with my research into local history, would it?" For just a moment, Hutchins' composure slipped. "I'm not sure what you mean. I mean my visits to the library and courthouse, my interest in oil patents from the 1940s, my questions about Thaddeus, Washington." The silence that followed was electric. Deputy Martinez looked confused, but Hutchins' face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Ancient history," Hutchins said finally. "Nothing to do with current property concerns." "Maybe," Xavier replied. "But I'm starting to think ancient history and current property concerns might be more connected than you'd like." Hutchins straightened his shoulders and put his political smile back in place. "Mr. Robinson, I think you might benefit from understanding how things work in Millbrook. This is a small community that values cooperation and stability. Sometimes newcomers get ideas that can disrupt that stability. Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice." From one businessman to another, Xavier looked at his granddaughters, both wide-eyed and clearly frightened by the confrontation between adults. Then he looked back at Roy Hutchins and made a decision that would change everything. "I appreciate the advice," he said quietly, "but I think I'll keep learning about local history. It's fascinating what you can discover when you start digging beneath the surface." Hutchins' smile finally disappeared entirely. "Some things are better left buried, Mr. Robinson, for everyone's sake." After the men left, Xavier held both girls while they told him about the questions they'd been asked. Nothing inappropriate, just inquiries about whether they felt safe, whether their grandfather had been acting strangely, whether he'd been showing them any dangerous areas around the property. But the message had been clear. Xavier Robinson was being watched, and his research into Thaddeus Washington had already attracted the wrong kind of attention. That night, as he tucked the girls into bed, Ella looked up at him with serious eyes. "Grandpa, are we in trouble?" "No, baby girl," Xavier said firmly. "We're not in trouble, but we might be onto something important, and that makes some people nervous." "What kind of important?" Xavier considered his words carefully. "The kind that proves good people deserve to be remembered, and wrong things deserve to be made right, even if it takes a long time." "Especially if it takes a long time," Xavier replied. "Sometimes the most important truths are the ones people try hardest to hide." Asterisk. Katie arrived the next morning carrying a shoebox wrapped in a faded tea towel, her expression mixing determination with worry. She found Xavier on the front porch, trying to coax life back into a vintage Coca-Cola machine that had probably last worked during the Reagan administration. Roy Hutchins called me last night, she said without preamble. Wanted to know what I told you about Thaddeus Washington. Xavier straightened, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. What did you tell him? I told him it was none of his damn business. Katie set the shoebox on a rusty metal table and unwrapped it carefully. But Xavier, he's scared. Really scared. That means whatever you found yesterday at the courthouse was significant. Inside the box lay dozens of letters, some still in their original envelopes, others loose and yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant despite being written in pencil, and Xavier could make out dates ranging from 1947 to early 1949. My grandmother saved everything, Katie explained. She and Thaddeus Washington were friends, real friends, not just acquaintances across racial lines. He used to talk to her about his inventions, his dreams for what the oil industry could become. Xavier picked up one of the letters dated February 1947 and read aloud. Dear Ruth, the patents have been approved, and my partners seem genuinely excited about the possibilities. Thomas Hutchins even spoke of expanding operations into Louisiana and New Mexico. For the first time in my life, I believe my children will have opportunities I could never have imagined. Thomas Hutchins? Katie said grimly. Roy's grandfather. Keep reading. The letters painted a picture of a brilliant man caught between hope and caution. Washington wrote about his drilling innovations with the passion of someone who understood. He was revolutionizing an industry, but he also expressed growing concerns about his white business partner's true intentions. Letter from June 1948 read, Ruth, I fear I may have been naive about the nature of business partnerships in Texas. Thomas and his associates have been asking detailed questions about my manufacturing processes and patent applications. When I suggested we formalize profit-sharing agreements in writing, they became evasive. Ernest Robinson has been a good friend through all this. He sees things clearly and warns me to be careful. Ernest Robinson, Xavier murmured. My father was already involved, trying to protect Washington. Ella emerged from the house, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She developed a habit of waking early to help with whatever project Xavier had undertaken, displaying a mechanical aptitude that surprised him. This morning she carried a handful of old electrical components. She'd been sorting for the Coca-Cola machine repair. These might work, Grandpa, she said, then noticed the letters. What are those? More pieces of the puzzle, Xavier said. Remember the man we talked about yesterday? Thaddeus Washington? These are letters he wrote to Miss Katie's grandmother. Ella set down her electrical parts and picked up one of the letters, studying the careful handwriting. At 10 years old, she could read well enough to make out most of the words, and her face grew serious as she absorbed the contents. He sounds sad, she observed, and worried. He was both, Katie confirmed, especially toward the end. The final letters, from early 1949, revealed Washington's growing desperation. He wrote about equipment mysteriously disappearing from job sites, drilling reports being altered without his knowledge, and mounting pressure from his business partners to sign new agreements that would reduce his stake in the company. The last letter, dated March 1949, was the most heartbreaking. Ruth, they have made their intentions clear. Either I sign over my patents and dissolve my partnership stake, or I will face criminal charges for theft and fraud. The evidence they claim to have is fabricated, but in Texas, in 1949, a black man's word carries little weight against white businessmen with political connections. I have no choice but to comply. Please tell Ernest that I appreciate his friendship and his attempts to help. Perhaps someday the truth will matter more than the color of a man's skin. Xavier felt anger building in his chest, not the hot rage of immediate injustice, but the cold fury that comes from understanding how systematically a good man had been destroyed. What happened to Washington after he signed over his rights? Nobody knows for certain, Katie said. He left Millbrook within a week of signing those papers and never came back. Some say he went to Chicago. Others think California. My grandmother got one more letter about 6 months later from Detroit. Washington said he was working in an auto plant and trying to forget he'd ever been an inventor. Did he have family? A wife and 2 young children. They went with him when he left. Ella looked up from the letter she'd been reading. "This is wrong," she said with the clear, moral certainty that children possess before the world teaches them to compromise. "These men stole from him." "Yes, they did," Xavier agreed. "The question is whether we can prove it and whether anyone will care." After all these years, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, drawn by voices, but still clutching Mr. Buttons. She'd been quieter than usual since yesterday's confrontation with Roy Hutchins, and Xavier could see the anxiety in her posture. "Are the mean men coming back?" she asked in a small voice. Xavier knelt down to her level. "No, sweetheart. And they weren't really mean. They were just worried about things that aren't any of their business. They made me scared," Elizabeth admitted. "I know. But you're safe with me and Ella and Miss Katie. We're not going to let anyone frighten you." Katie rummaged through the remaining letters and pulled out a manila envelope that looked different from the others. "There's one more thing, Xavier." Grandma Ruth kept this separate from Washington's letters. She said it was insurance, in case anyone ever tried to claim Washington had been treated fairly. Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents Xavier hadn't seen before. The original patent applications in Washington's handwriting, complete with detailed technical drawings that showed innovations far ahead of their time. But more importantly, there were also copies of correspondence between Thomas Hutchins and other oil company executives, discussing strategies for acquiring Washington's assets without excessive financial outlay. One letter, marked confidential and dated January 1949, was particularly damning. "The Negro inventor's techniques are worth millions, but he lacks the political protection to maintain his position. Sheriff Bradley has agreed to cooperate with any necessary legal proceedings, and Judge Morrison understands the economic importance of consolidating these patents under proper management." "They planned it," Xavier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They planned to steal everything from him months in advance. My grandmother copied these documents when she cleaned offices in the courthouse," Katie explained. "She was just the cleaning lady to them invisible. They never imagined she could read their correspondence or understand its significance." Ella studied the technical drawings with fascination. "Grandpa, these machines look really complicated. How did Mr. Washington figure out how to build them?" "The same way you figure out how to fix electrical components," Xavier said, "by being curious, observant, and willing to try new things. Washington was a genius, sweetheart. His ideas changed the oil industry forever. But he never got credit for it?" "No. Other people took credit and got rich from his work." Ella frowned, processing this injustice. "That's stealing." "Yes, it is. Can we give him credit now, even though he's gone?" Xavier looked at the documents spread across the table patents. Letters, photographs, and legal proof of a conspiracy that had robbed a brilliant man of his life's work. In his granddaughter's simple question, he heard an echo of his father's final message. "Tell him Thaddeus Washington deserves justice, even if it comes 100 years late." "Maybe we can," he said slowly. "It won't give Washington back his life or his family's security, but maybe we can make sure people remember his name and know what he accomplished." "What about the money?" Ella asked with the practical directness of childhood. "If they stole his ideas and got rich, shouldn't his family get that money back?" Xavier exchanged glances with Katie. The same thought had been growing in his mind as he'd absorbed the evidence. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "That's a very complicated question, baby girl," he said carefully. "It would require lawyers and courts and a lot of people who might not want the truth to come out. But it's the right thing to do." Ella pressed. "Yes, Xavier admitted. "It's the right thing to do." That afternoon, Xavier made a phone call that would change everything. He contacted a civil rights law firm in Houston that specialized in historical injustices, explaining his discoveries and asking if there might be legal grounds for pursuing justice after 75 years. The lawyer who took his call, Margaret Chun, no relation to the librarian, listened to Xavier's story with growing interest. By the end of their conversation, she'd agreed to review all the documents and provide a preliminary assessment of whether a case could be built. "Mr. Robinson," she said before hanging up, "if what you're telling me is accurate, this could be one of the most significant intellectual property theft cases in Texas history. The monetary damages alone, accumulated over 75 years of oil profits, could reach into the hundreds of millions." After the call, Xavier sat on his front porch watching his granddaughters play in the dusty yard. Ella was teaching Elizabeth how to identify different types of rocks, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd appointed herself the family expert on practical matters. Elizabeth listened with the intense concentration she brought to everything that mattered to her, occasionally asking questions that made Ella pause and think harder about her answers. These girls deserved security. They deserved a future free from the financial anxiety that had marked Xavier's entire adult life. But they also deserved to understand that some things mattered more than money, that integrity and justice weren't commodities to be traded for. Comfort. Xavier thought about Thaddeus Washington, forced to choose between his principles and his family's safety, ultimately sacrificing his life's work to protect those he loved. Now Xavier faced a similar choice, but with one crucial difference. He had evidence, legal support, and the possibility of success. The question was whether he had the courage to fight a battle that might cost him everything, including the peace and safety of the two little girls who depended on him for stability in a world that had already shown them too much chaos. As the sun set over the West Texas desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Xavier Robinson made his decision. Tomorrow, he would begin the fight to give Thaddeus Washington the justice he'd been denied. And if that fight brought consequences, he would face them with the same dignity his father had shown and the same courage Washington had, displayed in the face of impossible odds. Some debts, Ernest Robinson had written, can only be paid by the next generation. Xavier finally understood what his father had meant. Letters from Thaddeus Washington's descendants arrived 3 weeks later, forwarded through the civil rights law firm in Houston. Xavier opened them with shaking hands while Ella and Elizabeth ate breakfast at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through windows that were finally clean after days of scrubbing away decades of neglect. The first letter was from Dr. Sarah Washington Holmes, a professor of engineering at Wayne State University in Detroit. Her grandfather had been Thaddeus Washington's son, and she'd grown up hearing stories about the brilliant inventor who'd been forced to abandon his life's work in Texas. "Mr. Robinson," she wrote, "our family has waited 75 years for someone to care about the truth. My great-grandfather died in 1967, working in an auto plant until the day he collapsed on the factory floor. He never spoke of his inventions again after leaving Texas. But my grandfather saved all his papers, his blueprints, even his journal from those terrible final months. We always believed that someday someone would want to hear our side of the story." The second letter was from Marcus Washington, a mechanical engineer in Chicago whose great-uncle had been Thaddeus. He wrote about growing up poor in the inner city, knowing his family had once been close to greatness, but never understanding what had gone wrong. "My grandmother used to say that white men in Texas stole our legacy," he wrote. "I thought it was just bitterness until I became an engineer myself and started researching my great-uncle's patents. The technical innovations he developed in the 1940s weren't implemented industry-wide until the 1970s. He was 30 years ahead of his time." Ella looked up from her cereal. "Are these the letters you were waiting for, Grandpa?" "Yes, baby girl. These are from Thaddeus Washington's family, His descendants, who are still alive today, are they poor like we used to be? Xavier considered the question carefully. The Washington family letters painted a picture of working-class people who'd built decent lives through education and hard work, but who'd never achieved the generational wealth that should have been their inheritance. They're doing okay, but they never got the advantages that should have been theirs by right. Elizabeth, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. Will sharing the money make everyone happy? I hope so, sweetheart. But sometimes making things right is complicated, even when it's the right thing to do. Margaret Chun called that afternoon with news that made Xavier's head spin. Her preliminary research had confirmed what the document suggested. Thaddeus Washington's stolen patents had indeed formed the foundation for drilling techniques that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in profits over the decades. More importantly, the statute of limitations on patent theft didn't apply in cases where fraud could be proven, and the evidence Xavier had discovered constituted compelling proof of conspiracy. Mr. Robinson, she said, this case has the potential to result in a settlement or judgment of over $200 million. But I need you to understand what you're taking on. The defendants won't just be Roy Hutchins and his family company. There'll be major asterisk. Oil corporations that have built empires on technology they acquired through fraudulent means. They'll fight with everything they have. Xavier sat down heavily on his father's old couch, the magnitude of the situation finally hitting him. What are you saying? I'm saying that once we file this lawsuit, your life will never be the same. You'll be taking on some of the most powerful interests in Texas. People who've had 75 years to consolidate their wealth and influence. They'll investigate you, your family, your finances. They'll look for any leverage they can find to pressure you into dropping the case. And if we win? If we win, you and the Washington family will be wealthy beyond your current comprehension. But more importantly, you'll have corrected one of the most egregious injustices in American business history. That evening, Xavier gathered Ella and Elizabeth on the front porch to watch the sunset, a ritual that had become their way of transitioning from the day's challenges to the peace of evening. The desert air was cooling, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Girls, Xavier said carefully, I need to talk to you about some important decisions we have to make as a family. Ella, who'd become adept at reading adult moods, straightened her shoulders. Is it about the lawyer lady and the money? Partly. You see, the papers we found prove that Thaddeus Washington was cheated out of a lot of money, more money than most people see in their entire lives. We could go to court and try to get that money for his family and for us. How much money? Ella asked with the directness of a child who'd learned that financial security wasn't guaranteed. Xavier took a deep breath. Enough that you girls would never have to worry about having a home or going to college or anything like that. Enough that your children and their children would be secure. Elizabeth's eyes widened. That's a lot. Yes, it is. But getting that money would mean fighting very powerful people who don't want to give it up. It would mean a lot of attention from newspapers and television, lawyers and investigators. Our quiet life here would end, probably forever. Ella was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Finally, she asked, Grandpa, what would Great-Grandpa Ernest want us to do? Xavier felt tears prick his eyes. In her simple question, Ella had identified the heart of his dilemma. I think he'd want us to do what's right, even if it's hard. And what would Mama want? Elizabeth added softly. Xavier thought about Kaisha, struggling with demons he couldn't fight for her, working toward recovery one day at a time. Your Mama would want you girls to be safe and happy. But I think she'd also want you to be proud of your family, to know that we stood up for justice when it mattered. Elizabeth nodded seriously. Then we should do it. Ella looked at her younger sister with surprise. Are you sure, Lizzie? It might be scary sometimes. Lots of things are scary, Elizabeth replied with wisdom beyond her years. But Grandpa says the most important things are usually the hardest ones. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Xavier was replacing a broken window in the gas station office when 3 black SUVs pulled into the parking area, their occupants emerging in expensive suits that looked wildly out of place in the desert heat. The leader was a silver-haired man in his 60s who introduced himself as James Morrison, grandson of the judge who'd facilitated Thaddeus Washington's downfall in 1949. Behind him stood 2 younger men who had the polished look of corporate lawyers, and a woman with a briefcase who never offered her name. "Mr. Robinson," Morrison said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "I represent several business interests that have heard about your historical research. We thought it might be beneficial to have a conversation." Xavier wiped his hands on a rag, noting that Ella and Elizabeth had appeared in the doorway of the house, drawn by the sound of multiple vehicles. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where reasonable people find mutually beneficial solutions to complex problems," Morrison replied smoothly. "You see, we understand that you've discovered some old documents that have led you to believe certain historical irregularities occurred in business dealings from the 1940s. I've discovered proof that Thaddeus Washington was robbed of patents worth hundreds of millions of dollars through fraud and intimidation," Xavier said bluntly. Morrison's smile flickered but didn't disappear. "That's certainly one interpretation of events. But litigation is expensive and uncertain, Mr. Robinson, especially for a man in your circumstances with young dependents who require stability and security. What are you offering?" "A settlement. $5 million, paid immediately, in exchange for all documents related to Thaddeus Washington, and a signed agreement that this matter will not be pursued further." Xavier felt his breath catch. $5 million was more money than he'd ever dreamed of having enough to secure his granddaughters' futures, pay for the best treatment centers for Kaisha, and provide the stability his family desperately needed. But it was also a fraction of what the evidence suggested was rightfully owed, and it would mean abandoning the Washington family to continued injustice. "That's a generous offer," Xavier said carefully. "But I'm not the only party involved. Thaddeus Washington's descendants have legal claims too. We're prepared to offer them similar compensation," Morrison replied. "Everyone walks away with life-changing money, and we avoid the unpleasantness of prolonged litigation." "And if I refuse?" Morrison's smile finally disappeared. "Then you'll be choosing a very difficult path, Mr. Robinson. Fighting this case will consume years of your life and cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. You'll be subjected to intense scrutiny of your personal finances, your fitness as a guardian, your daughter's single quotes, challenges. And even if you somehow prevail, the appeals process could take another decade." The threat was clear, even delivered in polite language. Xavier looked at his granddaughters, still watching from the doorway, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, like a physical burden. "I need time to think about it," he said. "Of course, but this offer expires in 72 hours. After that, our clients will be prepared to defend themselves against what they consider baseless accusations." After the lawyers left, Xavier sat at his kitchen table with the Washington family letters spread before him, trying to reconcile the competing demands of prudence and principle. $5 million would solve every immediate problem in his life, but it would also mean that Thaddeus Washington's name would remain forgotten, his genius uncredited, his family's suffering unredeemed. Ella found him there an hour later, staring at the documents that had changed everything. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "are you going to take their money?" Xavier looked at his granddaughter, this brilliant, curious child who'd inherited her great-grandfather's mechanical aptitude and her great-great-grandfather's sense of justice. In her eyes, he saw the future of his family and the weight of the choice he had to make. "I don't know yet, baby girl," he said honestly. What do you think I should do? Ella considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. I think, she said finally, that taking their money would feel good for a little while. But knowing we gave up on doing the right thing would feel bad for a long time. Xavier reached across the table and took his granddaughter's hand. In that moment, he realized that his father had left him more than documents and mysteries. He'd left him a choice that would define not just Xavier's character, but the kind of man his granddaughters would grow up believing they could become. You're absolutely right, Xavier said, and I'm proud of you for seeing it so clearly. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of storms on the horizon. Change was coming to Millbrook, Texas, and Xavier Robinson was finally ready to meet it head-on. Asterisk. Xavier called Margaret Chung the next morning to reject the settlement offer. Her response was both encouraging and sobering. I'm proud of you for making the principled choice, Mr. Robinson. But now the real battle begins. She was right. Within days of the settlement deadline passing, Xavier's life transformed into something he barely recognized. Reporters began calling, first from local newspapers, then from regional television stations, and finally from national news outlets that had caught wind of the story. Texas oil fortune built on stolen black invention became a headline that spread across social media and cable news, bringing unwanted attention to the quiet desert town that had hoped this problem would quietly disappear. First sign of real trouble came on Tuesday morning when Xavier discovered that all 4 tires on his pickup truck had been slashed during the night. He stood in the early morning heat, staring at the deliberate damage, while Ella and Elizabeth watched from the kitchen window with wide, frightened eyes. Malik Johnson arrived 20 minutes after Xavier called him, took one look at the trucks, and shook his head grimly. This isn't random vandalism, he said. Someone's sending a message. What kind of message? The kind that says you're making powerful people nervous. Malik knelt beside one of the slashed tires, examining the clean cuts. Professional job. Probably done with a utility knife, quick and quiet. Should I call the sheriff? Malik gave Xavier a look that mixed sympathy with realism. You can try. But unless you've got video evidence, it'll be written up as random mischief. Roy Hutchins plays golf with Sheriff Bradley every Sunday. That afternoon brought more troubling news. Xavier received a certified letter from Child Protective Services informing him that an anonymous complaint had been filed questioning his fitness as a guardian. The letter cited concerns about unsafe living conditions, inadequate educational provisions, and potential exposure to adult conflicts unsuitable for minor children. Xavier, read the letter 3 times before its implications fully sank in. Someone was using his granddaughters as weapons against him, threatening the one thing that mattered more than any amount of money. They're trying to scare you into backing down, Margaret Chun explained during their emergency phone call. It's a common tactic in high-stakes litigation. They investigate every aspect of your life, looking for pressure points. Can they actually take the girls? Not based on what I've seen of your situation. You've provided a stable home. They're clearly well cared for, and Elizabeth's anxiety issues are being addressed. But you'll need to undergo a formal assessment, and that process can be stressful for everyone involved. That evening, Xavier set his granddaughters down for what he hoped would be a reassuring conversation. But Ella's first question cut straight to his deepest fears. Grandpa, are they going to take us away? Xavier felt his chest tighten. No, sweetheart. No one is going to take you away. Some people are angry about the lawsuit, so they're trying to cause trouble for us. But we're family, and we're going to stay together no matter what. Elizabeth, who'd been unusually quiet since the CPS letter arrived, spoke up in a small voice. Maybe we should just take the money and make everyone stop being mad at us. Xavier knelt down so he was at eye level with both girls. Elizabeth, do you remember what we talked about when we first found those papers? About doing what's right even when it's hard. She nodded reluctantly. Well, this is the hard part. But giving up now wouldn't just mean taking money that isn't rightfully ours. It would mean teaching you girls that bullies win when they threaten people. And I won't do that. But I'm scared, Elizabeth admitted, tears starting to form in her eyes. I'm scared too, Xavier said honestly. Being scared doesn't mean we're doing the wrong thing. It just means we're doing something important. Ella, who'd been listening with the intense concentration she brought to all serious discussions, suddenly straightened her shoulders. Grandpa, what if we made a video? What kind of video? Like the news people do. We could tell everyone about Mr. Washington and show them the papers and explain why this matters. Then people would understand we're not just being greedy. Xavier stared at his 10-year-old granddaughter, amazed once again by her clarity of thought. That's actually a brilliant idea. Baby girl. The video they made was simple but powerful. Xavier sat at the kitchen table with the girls flanking him. The original documents and photographs spread before them. Speaking directly to his phone's camera, he told Thaddeus Washington's story with the calm authority of a man who knew he was standing on solid moral ground. Ella held up the technical drawings, explaining in her clear young voice how Washington's innovations had changed oil drilling forever. Elizabeth, despite her shyness, managed to read one of Washington's letters aloud, a voice conveying the heartbreak of a brilliant man forced to abandon his life's work. This isn't about money, Xavier concluded, looking directly into the camera. This is about making sure that a good man's name is remembered and that his family finally gets the recognition they deserve. If we don't stand up for justice when we have the chance, what kind of example are we setting for our children? Margaret Chen helped them post the video on social media platforms and sent it to friendly journalists. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. By the end of the week, it had reached millions of people, generating a groundswell of support that surprised everyone, including Xavier. The response wasn't universally positive. Xavier's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, supporters, and an unfortunately large number of people who felt compelled to share their opinions about uppity, black families, and frivolous lawsuits. But for every hateful message, there were 10 more from people who understood the deeper principles at stake. Dr. Sarah Washington Holmes flew in from Detroit the following weekend, bringing with her a suitcase full of documents that had been preserved by Thaddeus Washington's family for 3 generations. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with her great-grandfather's intelligent eyes and her family's quiet dignity. Mr. Robinson, she said as they sat in Katie's diner, away from the reporters, who'd begun camping out near the gas station. You can't imagine what it means to my family to finally have someone willing to fight for my great-grandfather's memory. It's the right thing to do, Xavier replied simply. Perhaps. But right things don't always get done, especially when they threaten powerful interests. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a leather-bound journal. This was Thaddeus's personal diary from his final months in Texas. I've never shown it to anyone outside the family, but I think you should read it. The diary entries were heartbreaking in their detail. Washington had documented every meeting with his business partners, every veiled threat, every piece of evidence that his white associates were planning to steal his innovations. The final entries, written a days before he signed away his rights, revealed a man torn between protecting his family and preserving his integrity. They told me that if I fought the charges, my wife and children would face consequences, Washington had written. Thomas Hutchins made it clear that a black man in Texas in 1949 had no chance against white businessmen with political connections. I can endure poverty, but I cannot risk my family's safety. Perhaps someday, when the world is different, someone will care enough to tell the truth. He knew, Xavier said softly. He knew exactly what was happening to him, and he documented everything, hoping that someday someone would use it to set the record straight. Dr. Washington Holmes nodded. My great-grandfather was a brilliant man. But more than that, he was a good man. He understood that fighting for justice isn't just about the people who are wronged, it's about the kind of society we choose to create. That night, as Xavier tucked his granddaughters into bed, Ella asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. "Grandpa, what happens if we lose?" Xavier considered his answer carefully. "If we lose, we'll still have each other, and we'll still know we did the right thing. And sometimes that's enough. But what if we win? If we win, we'll have enough money to secure our future and help other people. But more importantly, we'll have proven that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied." Elizabeth, who'd been listening quietly, surprised him with her next words. "I want Mr. Washington's great-granddaughter to know that we're fighting for him." "She knows, sweetheart, and she's very grateful." "Good," Elizabeth said firmly, "because everyone deserves to have someone fight for them." As Xavier turned out the lights and listened to his granddaughters settle into sleep, he reflected on how much their lives had changed since that day he'd first found the loose floorboard. They'd gone from being three people adrift in the aftermath of loss to being the center of a story that might redefine American business history. The road ahead was uncertain and undoubtedly difficult, but for the first time since Kaisha's addiction had torn their family apart, Xavier felt like they were moving towards something meaningful rather than just running from catastrophe outside. The desert wind carried the sounds of change, the distant hum of news vans, the murmur of supporters who had begun gathering to show solidarity, and somewhere beneath it all, the whisper of history finally ready to be told. Asterisk, the letter was hidden behind Ernest Robinson's bedroom dresser, sealed in a plastic bag and taped to the back panel where only someone moving the heavy furniture would find it. Xavier discovered it 3 months into the legal battle, while cleaning out his father's possessions to make space for Elizabeth's growing collection of books and Ella's mechanical projects. The envelope bore Xavier's name in his father's careful handwriting, along with instructions to be opened only if you decide to pursue justice for Thaddeus Washington. Xavier's hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a letter dated just 6 months before Ernest's death, written in the measured tone of a man who carried heavy secrets for too long. "Son," it began, "if you're reading this, then you found the documents and chosen the difficult path. Before you go any further, you need to understand the full truth about what happened to Thaddeus Washington and why I made the choices I did." Xavier sat down on his father's bed, the afternoon light streaming through the windows, falling across pages that would reshape everything he thought he knew about his family's history. Asterisk, I wasn't just a friend to Thaddeus Washington. Ernest had written, I was his business partner, the one person he trusted completely, and ultimately, the man who betrayed him to save my own family. The words hit Xavier like a physical blow. He read them again, hoping he'd misunderstood, but the meaning was unmistakable. His father hadn't just witnessed Thaddeus Washington's downfall, he'd participated in it. The letter continued in 1947. When Thaddeus formed his partnership with Thomas Hutchins and the other white investors, he insisted on having someone he could trust involved in the business operations. He asked me to serve as the company's equipment manager and his personal liaison. I was honored by his trust, and for 2 years, I watched him revolutionize oil drilling while being systematically undermined by men who smiled to his face and plotted against him in private. By early 1949, I knew what Hutchins and his associates were planning. They'd made their intentions clear during meetings they thought Thaddeus wouldn't hear about. They were going to frame him for theft, use fabricated evidence to force him out, and claim his patents as compensation for alleged damages. I tried to warn Thaddeus, but he refused to believe that his business partners would go that far. Then Hutchins approached me with an offer I'll regret for the rest of my life. They knew I had gambling debts, serious debts to dangerous people in Dallas. Your mother was pregnant with you, and I was desperate to protect my family. Hutchins offered to pay off my debts and give me a management position in his company if I would provide testimony supporting their case against Thaddeus. Xavier felt sick as he read the next. Paragraph. I told myself I was just one man, that my testimony wouldn't make the difference between Thaddeus's success and failure. I convinced myself that smart men like him would find a way to fight back, that justice would prevail somehow. But I was lying to myself, and I knew it even then. When the time came, I testified that I'd seen Thaddeus remove company equipment without authorization, and that I'd witnessed him altering drilling reports. None of it was true, but my word as a white man carried weight that Thaddeus's denials could not overcome. The case was decided before it even went to court. Thaddeus never spoke to me again after the hearing. The last time I saw him, he looked at me with such profound disappointment, and I've carried the shame of that moment every day since. He didn't curse me or threaten me. He just said, "I thought you were different, Ernest. I thought I could trust you to do the right thing when it mattered." Xavier set the letter down and walked to the window, needing air, needing space to process the magnitude of his father's confession. Everything he'd built his case on, every assumption about his family's moral authority in this fight, had just crumbled. Ernest Robinson hadn't been a witness to injustice. He'd been an accomplice. Xavier forced himself to continue reading. I used the money from Hutchins to buy this gas station, thinking I could build an honest life on a dishonest foundation. But blood money never brings peace, son. Every day I worked here, I thought about Thaddeus and his family, wondering what became of them, knowing I could never make amends for what I'd done. When I learned about your troubles in Dallas, about Kaisha's addiction and your custody of the girls, I knew this was my chance to finally balance the scales. I saved every document, every piece of evidence, hoping that someday you would have the courage I lacked. The choice I couldn't make, you would have to make for both of us. I'm leaving you the truth, son, even though it makes me a villain in the story I'm asking you to tell. Thaddeus Washington deserves justice, but his family also deserves to know that someone from the Robinson family finally stood up for what's right. I pray you'll be the man I should have been. The letter concluded with specific instructions about where to find additional documents that Ernest had hidden correspondence between himself and Thomas Hutchins, records of payments received, and most damning of all, a signed confession that Ernest had written but never submitted, detailing his false testimony and the coercion he'd faced. Xavier sank into his father's old armchair, the letter trembling in his hands. Outside, he could hear Ella and Elizabeth playing in the yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. How could he continue fighting for justice when his own family had been complicit in the original crime? Margaret Chun's reaction to the revelations was swift and practical. "This doesn't change the fundamental facts of the case," she said during their emergency phone call. "If anything, it strengthens our position by providing eyewitness testimony about the conspiracy. Your father's confession proves that the case against Washington was fabricated, but my family profited from it." Xavier protested. "The money Hutchins paid my father, the gas station he bought with it, we've been living off the proceeds of that betrayal. That's true, but it doesn't invalidate Washington's claims or your right to pursue justice on his behalf. If anything, it gives you a unique moral obligation to make amends." Dr. Sarah Washington Holmes's response was even more surprising. When Xavier called to confess his father's role in her great-grandfather's downfall, expecting anger and rejection, she listened in silence before responding with quiet grace. "Mr. Robinson, do you think you're the first person to discover that their family history includes shameful chapters? My great-grandfather was forced to abandon his life's work, but he understood that good people sometimes make terrible choices when they're frightened. What matters now is what you do with the truth you've discovered. But how can I represent his interests when my family wronged him? Because," she said simply, "you're choosing to do what your father couldn't. That's not hypocrisy. That's redemption." That evening, Xavier gathered his granddaughters for what he knew would be the most difficult conversation of their young lives. They sat on the front porch as the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Xavier of the beauty that could emerge even from harsh landscapes. "Girls," he began carefully, "I found another letter from your great-grandfather, and it changes some things about our story." Ella, who'd become increasingly invested in the details of the legal case, straightened with attention. "What kind of things?" It turns out that great-grandfather Ernest wasn't just a friend to Thaddeus Washington. He was involved in the business, and when the white men decided to steal Washington's patents, they pressured Ernest to help them. Elizabeth frowned. "Help them steal?" "Yes, they threatened our family, and Ernest was scared. So he lied in court, saying things about Washington that weren't true, and that helped the bad men take everything away from him." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Finally, Ella spoke up, her voice small and confused. "So great-grandfather was one of the bad guys?" Xavier chose his words carefully. "Great-grandfather was a man who faced an impossible choice and made the wrong decision. But he spent the rest of his life regretting it and trying to find a way to make it right. That's why he saved all those documents for us. Does this mean we can't fight for Mr. Washington anymore?" Elizabeth asked. "Some people might say that. They might say our family doesn't have the right to seek justice, because we were part of the original wrong." Ella was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the gravity she brought to all serious matters. "Grandpa," she said finally, "if someone in your family did something bad, does that mean you can't try to fix it? What do you think?" "I think maybe it means you have to try even harder to fix it," Ella said with conviction. "Because now it's not just about helping strangers, it's about making up for what your family did." "Wrong." Elizabeth nodded solemnly. "Like when I break something and then try to fix it to make Ella not mad at me anymore." Xavier felt tears prick his eyes. Once again, his granddaughters had cut through moral complexity to reach simple truth. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes the best way to honor the people who came before us is to do better than they did. So we're still going to fight?" Ella asked, "If you girls are still willing to help me, yes. But now, we're not just fighting for justice, we're fighting for redemption." The next morning, Xavier made a decision that surprised everyone, including Margaret Chun. He called a press conference and read his father's confession aloud, in its entirety, to a room full of reporters who'd been following the case. He explained how Ernest Robinson had been coerced into betraying his friend, how the Robinson family had unknowingly benefited from that betrayal, and how they were now committed to making amends. "I'm not asking for sympathy for my father's choices," Xavier concluded, facing the cameras with quiet dignity. "I'm asking for the opportunity to do what he couldn't to tell the truth. Seek justice and ensure that Thaddeus Washington's legacy is finally honored. Sometimes the most important thing a family can do is break the cycle of silence that protects old wrongs." The revelation sent shockwaves through the media coverage of the case. Some commentators questioned whether Xavier had the moral authority to pursue the lawsuit, while others argued that his family's complicity made their quest for justice even more compelling. But in the Washington family, the response was unanimous support. Marcus Washington, the engineer from Chicago, called Xavier personally to express his gratitude. "Your father was human," he said. "He made a mistake under pressure, but he spent the rest of his life trying to correct it. That's more than most people would do." That night, as Xavier tucked his granddaughters into bed, Ella looked up at him with serious eyes. "Grandpa, are you sad about what great-grandfather did?" "Yes, baby girl. But I'm also proud of what we're doing to make it right. Will people think we're bad because of what he did?" Xavier smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Some people might. But the people whose opinions matter, people like you and Elizabeth and the Washington family, they understand that we can't change the past, but we can choose what to do with the future." Elizabeth spoke up from her bed across the room. "I think Mr. Washington would be happy that we're trying to help his family, even though our family hurt him." "I think so too," Xavier agreed. And I think great-grandfather Ernest would be proud that we found the courage he couldn't find. As he turned out the lights and listened to his granddaughters settle into sleep, Xavier reflected on the twisted path that had brought them to this moment. The truth was more complicated than he'd ever imagined, but it was still the truth. And sometimes the most important battles are fought not despite our family's failures, but because of them. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying with it the voices of the past and the promise of redemption that comes to those brave enough to confront their own history. Asterisk. The Washington family reunion took place 6 months after Ernest Robinson's confession became public, in the unlikely setting of Katie's Kitchen in downtown Millbrook. Dr. Sarah Washington Holmes had flown in from Detroit. Marcus Washington had driven down from Chicago, and 3 other descendants had made the journey from various corners of the country where Thaddeus Washington's family had scattered. After his forced exile from Texas, Xavier stood at the diner's window, watching his granddaughters play in the small park across the street with Washington children and grandchildren who'd never met before this weekend. The sight of multiple generations connected by shared history and common purpose filled him with a bittersweet satisfaction that reminded him why this fight mattered more than money. "They look happy," observed Dr. Washington Holmes, joining him at the window. "My great-grandfather would be amazed to see his family and yours working together. After all these years, he'd probably be amazed that anyone remembered his name," Xavier replied. "That's what injustice does. It tries to erase people completely." The legal proceedings had reached a critical juncture. Margaret Chun's team had spent months building a comprehensive case that combined historical evidence, expert testimony about the value of Washington's innovations, and financial analysis of the profits generated by his stolen patents over 7 decades. The defendants now including not just Roy Hutchins and his family company, but 3 major oil corporations that had acquired rights to Washington's technology, were mounting an aggressive defense that attacked both the evidence and the plaintiff's motives. "Mr. Robinson," Dr. Washington Holmes said quietly, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens in court, my family considers this case already won. For 75 years, we've carried the shame of our ancestors' defeat. You've given us back our pride." Xavier was about to respond when his phone rang. Margaret Chun's voice carried an urgency that made his stomach clench. "Xavier, we need to talk immediately. Can you come to the courthouse?" An hour later, Xavier sat in a conference room that felt like a war room, surrounded by boxes of documents, legal briefs, and the grim faces of attorneys who'd been working 18-hour days for months. Margaret Chen looked exhausted but determined as she spread new papers across the table. "The defendants have filed a motion to dismiss based on newly discovered evidence," she began without preamble. "They claim to have found documents proving that Thaddeus Washington voluntarily sold his patents and that all subsequent business dealings were legitimate." Xavier felt his chest tighten. "What kind of documents?" "Correspondence allegedly from Washington to his business partners, expressing satisfaction with the financial arrangements and his desire to leave the oil business to pursue other opportunities. A bill of sale for his patents signed in Washington's hand. Even a letter supposedly written to his wife explaining his decision to relocate the family. That's impossible. We have his diary, his letters to Ruth Harrison. We know he was coerced. That's what makes this so dangerous," Margaret said grimly. "These documents appear to be authentic. The paper is the right age. The ink composition matches other samples from the 1940s. Even the handwriting looks legitimate. But the content directly contradicts everything we know about Washington's state of mind during that period." Xavier studied the photocopies of the alleged documents, searching for obvious signs of fraud. The handwriting did look like Washington's script from the authentic letters they'd found, and the paper bore the yellowing and wear patterns of genuine historical documents. "How is this possible?" "Two possibilities," Margaret explained. "Either We've been fundamentally wrong about what happened to Washington. Or someone has created sophisticated forgeries using advanced techniques to age paper and ink artificially. Which do you think it is?" Margaret's expression was grim. "I think someone with significant resources and access to historical document experts has spent considerable time and money creating evidence to destroy our case. The question is whether we can prove it before the judge makes a ruling." That evening, Xavier returned to the gas station feeling more discouraged than at any point since the case began. The Washington family had returned to their hotels, planning to stay through the week as the legal team worked frantically to respond to the new evidence. Xavier found Ella and Elizabeth waiting for him on the front porch, their faces reflecting the anxiety that had become a constant presence in their lives. "Grandpa," Ella said as he approached, "Miss Katie called. She sounded worried and said you should call her back right away." Xavier's phone was already ringing as he reached for it. Katie's voice was tight with excitement and urgency. "Xavier, you need to get down here immediately. I found something in my grandmother's things that might help." 20 minutes later, Xavier stood in Katie's cluttered attic while she rummaged through boxes of memorabilia that hadn't been touched in decades. The space smelled of old paper and lavender sachets, and dust motes danced in the light from a single bare bulb. "After I heard about those new documents, I remembered something Grandma Ruth used to say," Katie explained, pulling items from a trunk that looked like it hadn't been opened since the 1960s. She always claimed she had insurance, in case anyone ever tried to change the story about what happened to Thaddeus Washington. "What kind of insurance?" She never said exactly, but she hinted that she'd kept copies of things that proved the truth. "I thought it was just an old woman's paranoia, but now ... Katie pulled out a manila envelope, sealed with wax and labeled in careful script for when they try to lie about TUIs. Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents that made Xavier's heart race, carbon copies of the forged letters supposedly written by Washington, dated 1949 but bearing a notation in different handwriting that read, "Practice drafts, the H signature work needs improvement." Xavier breathed. "Thomas Hutchins. Grandma Ruth cleaned offices at night," Katie explained. "She saw everything, copied what she could, and saved it all. She knew someday someone would try to rewrite history. The carbon copies were a smoking gun proof that the defendants' newly discovered evidence was fabricated, created in 1949 as backup documentation to support their theft of Washington's patents. Even more damning, the envelope contained a handwritten note from Thomas Hutchins to his attorney. "If the Negro proves troublesome, we have alternative documentation prepared to demonstrate his willing participation in all business arrangements." Xavier felt a surge of hope mixed with rage. The same family that had destroyed Thaddeus Washington in 1949 was now trying to destroy his memory and his descendants' legal rights, using the same fabricated evidence they'd prepared 75 years earlier. "Katie, do you understand what this means?" "It means we've got them," she said with satisfaction. "And it means Grandma Ruth was right to be paranoid." Margaret Chun's reaction to the discovery was electric. "This is beyond a smoking gun. This is a signed confession. We can prove not only that the new evidence is forged, but that it was forged contemporaneously with the original theft. It demonstrates a continuing pattern of fraud spanning multiple generations." The next morning, Xavier stood before Judge Patricia Morales in the federal courthouse in Houston, feeling the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. The courtroom was packed with reporters, Washington family members, and supporters who'd been following the case for months. In the defendants section sat Roy Hutchins and a phalanx of expensive lawyers, representing oil companies whose collective worth exceeded most small nations. GDP. Margaret Chen presented Ruth Harrison's evidence with the precision of a surgeon, methodically demonstrating how the carbon copies matched the defendant's supposedly authentic documents, how the handwriting analysis revealed multiple authors, and how the paper aging had been artificially accelerated using techniques that left microscopic traces. Your Honor, she concluded, this case represents one of the most audacious attempts at historical revisionism we've ever encountered. The defendants are literally trying to rewrite history using the same forged documents their predecessors created to facilitate the original theft. The defendant's lead attorney, a silver-haired man whose hourly rate probably exceeded Xavier's annual income, attempted to argue that the Harrison documents could themselves be forgeries, but his arguments sounded desperate even to Xavier's untrained ear. Judge Morales, a dignified woman in her 60s who'd spent her career dealing with complex civil rights cases, listened to both sides with the impassive attention of someone who'd heard every possible legal argument. When the presentations concluded, she announced that she would render her decision within 30 days. However, she added, fixing the defendant's table with a stern look, I want to make clear that if this court determines that evidence has been fabricated, or that officers of the court have participated in fraud, there will be serious consequences beyond the civil matters at hand. Outside the courthouse, Xavier found himself surrounded by reporters and supporters, but his attention was focused on his granddaughters, who'd been sitting in the gallery with Dr. Washington Holmes during the proceedings. Ella's face showed the intense concentration she brought to all important events, while Elizabeth clutched Mr. Buttons and stayed close to his side. Grandpa, Ella said as they walked toward their truck, do you think we won? I think we told the truth as clearly as we could, Xavier replied. Sometimes that's all you can do. Will the mean people try to make up more lies about Mr. Washington? Xavier considered the question seriously. Throughout the case, he'd tried to be honest with his granddaughters about the complexities of seeking justice. In a world where powerful interests would rather preserve profitable lies than acknowledge uncomfortable truths, they might, he said finally. But now everyone knows to look carefully at anything they claim. It's hard to fool people twice with the same trick. That evening, as Xavier tucked the girls into bed in their hotel room they'd stayed in Houston to await the judge's decision, Elizabeth surprised him with a question that cut to the heart of everything they'd been fighting for. Grandpa, if we win, will Mr. Washington finally be happy? Xavier thought about Thaddeus Washington, forced to abandon his life's work and die in anonymity, never knowing if anyone would remember his genius or care about the injustice done to him. I think he'll be proud of his family for never giving up, and proud of us for helping him. Even though our family hurt him first? Especially because of that, Xavier said gently. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is admit when your family was wrong and try to make it right. As he kissed his granddaughters good night, Xavier reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. In 30 days, they would learn whether decades of legal precedent, historical evidence, and moral arguments could overcome the entrenched power of wealth and influence. But regardless of the judge's decision, Xavier knew they had already achieved something important. Thaddeus Washington's name would be remembered, his genius acknowledged, and his family's dignity restored. Sometimes, that kind of victory mattered more than any amount of money dot outside their hotel window. The lights of Houston stretched to the horizon, each one representing lives and stories and struggles that rarely made headlines. Tomorrow, one of those stories would either be vindicated or buried forever. Xavier Robinson was ready for either outcome, but he hoped with every fiber of his being that justice delayed would not, this time, mean justice denied. Judge Patricia Morales entered the courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning that would reshape the lives of everyone present. Xavier sat in the front row between Dr. Sarah Washington Holmes and his granddaughters, feeling the collective held breath of dozens of people who'd invested months of hope in this moment. The judge's expression revealed nothing as she settled behind the bench and opened a thick folder that contained the future of the Washington family's legal claims. In the defendant's section, Roy Hutchins sat rigid with tension, while his lawyers shuffled papers with the nervous energy of people who knew their arguments had been systematically dismantled. "This case," Judge Morales began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "represents one of the most complex civil rights and intellectual property matters to come before this court. The plaintiffs seek recognition and compensation for innovations stolen from Thaddeus Washington through fraud and intimidation in 1949. The defendants claim that Mr. Washington willingly sold his patents and that all subsequent business dealings were legitimate." Xavier felt Ella's small hand slip into his as the judge continued her preliminary remarks. On his other side, Elizabeth pressed close against his arm, clutching Mr. Buttons with the intensity of someone seeking comfort from familiar things in an unfamiliar world. The evidence presented by both sides requires careful consideration not only of the legal issues involved, but of the historical context in which these events occurred. We must remember that 1949 Texas was a time and place where racial intimidation was common and black entrepreneurs faced systematic discrimination that often made legal remedies impossible. A murmur rippled through the courtroom at this acknowledgement. Xavier glanced at the Washington family members, seeing decades of frustration and hope reflected in their faces. The plaintiffs have presented compelling evidence that Thaddeus Washington was indeed the victim of a conspiracy designed to steal his intellectual property. The defendant Hutchins family's business records, combined with contemporaneous documents preserved by the Robinson and Harrison families, paint a clear picture of deliberate fraud. Judge Morales paused to review her notes, the silence in the courtroom so complete that Xavier could hear his own heartbeat. However, this court must also address the defendant's claim that newly discovered documents prove Mr. Washington willingly participated in all business arrangements. Xavier's stomach clenched. Despite Margaret Chun's confidence in their response to the forged evidence, the possibility remained that legal technicalities could undermine their case. Documents presented by the defendants appear, at first examination, to support their position. Letters allegedly written by Mr. Washington express satisfaction with his business arrangements and voluntary decisions to relocate his family. A bill of sale bears what appears to be his authentic signature. Roy Hutchins straightened slightly, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "However," Judge Morales continued, her tone sharpening, "the evidence presented by the plaintiffs in response to these documents raises serious questions about their authenticity. The carbon copies discovered by Ms. Harrison demonstrate that documents identical to the defendant's evidence were prepared in 1949 as what can only be described as insurance against potential challenges to the original theft." Xavier felt the tension in the courtroom shift as the judge's words sank in. Several reporters began taking notes furiously. The handwriting analysis, conducted by court-appointed experts, confirms that while the signatures on the defendant's documents superficially resemble Mr. Washington's hand, they contain subtle inconsistencies suggesting forgery by someone skilled in document fabrication. More damning still, the paper aging analysis reveals artificial acceleration techniques that were not available in 1949 but have been developed in recent decades. Dr. Washington Holmes reached across Xavier to squeeze Ella's other hand, tears beginning to form in her eyes. This court finds that the defendant's newly discovered evidence consists entirely of sophisticated forgeries created in recent months, using authentic 1940s paper and ink, but employing modern aging techniques to simulate historical authenticity. This represents not only contempt for the legal process, but a continuation of the same pattern of fraud that victimized Mr. Washington 75 years ago. The silence that followed was electric. Xavier felt as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Furthermore, Judge Morales continued, the carbon copies preserved by Ruth Harrison provide irrefutable proof that the Hutchins family prepared false documentation in 1949 to defend against potential challenges to their theft of Mr. Washington's intellectual property. The notation, practice drafts DH signature work, needs improvement, constitutes a signed confession of conspiracy to commit fraud. Roy Hutchins had gone pale, his lawyers frantically whispering among themselves as they realized the magnitude of their illegal disaster. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that Thaddeus Washington was indeed the victim of a conspiracy to steal his intellectual property through fraud, intimidation, and false legal proceedings. His patents were obtained through coercion, and the subsequent profits generated by his innovations were unlawfully obtained. Xavier felt tears streaming down his face as the judge's words validated everything they'd fought for. Beside him, Ella was grinning with the triumphant joy of someone who'd never doubted that truth would prevail, while Elizabeth pressed her face against his arm and whispered, "We won, Grandpa. We won." Therefore, Judge Morales announced, her voice carrying the weight of historical justice finally delivered. This court grants judgment in favor of the plaintiffs and orders full restitution of all profits unlawfully obtained through the use of Thaddeus Washington's stolen intellectual property. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. Washington family members embraced each other with tears of joy and vindication, and supporters cheered despite the bailiff's calls for order. Xavier sat in the center of the chaos, holding his granddaughters close and feeling the presence of those who couldn't be there. Thaddeus Washington, whose genius had finally been acknowledged. Ernest Robinson, whose final act of courage had made this moment possible. And all the descendants of both families who'd carried the burden of this injustice for 3 generations. The specific amount of restitution, Judge Morales continued once order was restored, will be determined in subsequent proceedings, but preliminary calculations suggest damages in excess of $200 million. As Xavier absorbed the magnitude of the victory, he realized that the money, while significant, was secondary to the restoration of dignity and truth that had taken place in this courtroom. Thaddeus Washington's name would be remembered not as a footnote to other men's success, but as a brilliant inventor whose legacy had finally been reclaimed by those who loved him enough to fight for justice. Across the decades, the celebration lasted 3 days. Media outlets from across the country descended on Millbrook to cover what CNN called the most significant civil rights victory in decades, while legal experts debated the precedent set by a case that proved historical injustices could still be remedied despite the passage of time. Xavier found himself overwhelmed by the attention. Reporters wanted interviews, documentary producers offered contracts, and civil rights organizations invited him to speak at conferences about fighting for justice. But all he really wanted was to return to the quiet of his father's gas station with his granddaughters and process what they'd accomplished. The financial settlement, when finally calculated, exceeded even Margaret Chun's most optimistic projections. After accounting for legal fees and expert witness costs, the Washington family would receive $134 million, while Xavier and his granddaughters would receive $89 million as compensation for Ernest Robinson's coerced participation in the original fraud. "It's more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes," Xavier told Dr. Washington Holmes as they sat in Katie's diner the morning after the final settlement hearing. "But somehow it doesn't feel real yet." "It will," she assured him. "But more importantly, my great-grandfather's name will be remembered. There's talk of endowing an engineering scholarship in his honor, maybe even a research institute focused on sustainable energy innovations." Ella, who'd been quietly drawing at the table beside them, looked up from her sketchpad. "Grandpa, What are we going to do with all that money? Xavier had been asking himself the same question for weeks. The settlement was structured to provide immediate access to $10 million, with the remainder placed in managed trusts that would generate substantial annual income for generations. What do you think we should do with it? He asked. Ella considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. Well, first we should make sure Elizabeth can go to any college she wants and get help for her anxiety stuff. And we should help Mama get better. Xavier felt his chest tighten. Keisha was in her 4th month at a treatment facility in Arizona, and while her progress was encouraging, her recovery remained fragile. The settlement would ensure she'd have access to the best care available for as long as she needed it. Those are excellent ideas, Xavier said. What else? We should fix up the gas station really nice, so people remember Mr. Washington when they visit. And maybe we could help other people who've been treated unfairly, but don't have enough money to fight back. Elizabeth, who'd been listening while coloring in a book about desert animals, added softly, and we should get a bigger house so Mama can come home when she's ready. Xavier looked at his granddaughters, these remarkable little girls, who'd faced more upheaval in their young lives than most adults experience in decades, yet who'd maintained their compassion and their sense of justice throughout their family's transformation. They understood intuitively what he was still learning, that wealth was meaningful only insofar as it enabled you to protect those you loved and help those who needed it. The transformation began immediately. Xavier hired contractors to restore the gas station to its 1940s glory while adding modern amenities and a small museum dedicated to Thaddeus Washington's life and innovations. The project became a community effort, with Malik Johnson supervising the mechanical restoration and Katie Harrison curating historical displays from documents and photographs donated by both families. More significantly, Xavier established the Washington Robinson Foundation for Historical Justice, dedicated to helping individuals and families pursue legal remedies for historical wrongs. Margaret Chen agreed to serve as the Foundation's chief legal officer, with a staff of attorneys specializing in civil rights cases that other firms might consider too risky or unprofitable. The Foundation's first major case involved a family in Louisiana whose ancestor had been cheated out of valuable land through forged documents in the 1920s. The second case centered on a Native American tribe's claim to mineral rights stolen through fraudulent treaties. Within 6 months, the Foundation was fielding requests from across the country. You're going to change how this country deals with historical injustice, Margaret Chen told Xavier during one of their Foundation planning meetings. Every case you win establishes precedent for others who've been waiting generations for someone to care about their family's story. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Keisha completed her treatment program and moved into a small house Xavier had purchased on the outskirts of Millbrook, close enough for daily contact with her daughters, but independent enough to continue her recovery without the pressure of immediate responsibility. The reunion, when it finally happened, took place at the restored gas station on a warm Saturday afternoon in spring. Xavier watched from the porch as Keisha emerged from her car, nervous but clear-eyed, and saw Ella and Elizabeth running toward their mother with the uninhibited joy of children who'd never stopped believing their family could be whole again. "Mama," Elizabeth called out, launching herself into Keisha's arms. "We won the lawsuit, and Grandpa's famous now, and we're going to help lots of people." Keisha looked over her daughters' heads at Xavier, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, I'm so proud of you." "Of all of you, we're proud of you too," Xavier replied, approaching slowly to give his daughter the space she needed. "You did the hardest work of all." The family spent the afternoon exploring the transformed gas station, now gleaming with fresh paint and filled with exhibits that told Thaddeus Washington's story. Ella served as tour guide, explaining the technical innovations displayed in glass cases and reading aloud from Washington's Letters with the confidence of someone who'd become an expert in her family's adopted history. Elizabeth showed her mother the memorial plaque that had been installed near the entrance. Thaddeus Washington, 1905 to 1967. Brilliant inventor, visionary engineer, and victim of injustice finally made right. He would have been so happy to see this, Dr. Washington Holmes said. Arriving with several other family members, Ford had become an informal celebration. To know that his name is remembered and his legacy protected. As evening approached, the crowd of well-wishers gradually dispersed, leaving Xavier alone with his family on the front porch of the house where so much of their journey had begun. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. "Grandpa," Ella said, leaning against his arm, "do you think great-grandfather Ernest would be proud of what we did?" Xavier considered the question carefully. His father had carried the weight of his betrayal for decades, using his final years to gather evidence and create opportunities for redemption he'd never lived to see. "I think he'd be amazed that his granddaughters turned out to be braver and wiser than he ever was," Xavier said finally. "And I think he'd be grateful that you helped him finally do the right thing." Kaisha, who'd been quiet for most of the afternoon, spoke up from the porch swing where she sat with Elizabeth curled against her side. "I miss so much," she said softly. "All those months when you were fighting this battle, learning about our family's history, growing up so fast. But you're here now," Elizabeth said with the simple directness that characterized all her important observations. "And now we can make new memories." "That's right," Xavier agreed. "We can't change the past, but we can choose what to do with the future." As the stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, Xavier reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a laid-off factory worker facing an uncertain future with two traumatized granddaughters and a daughter lost to addiction. Today, he was the head of a family that had helped rewrite American business history while building the foundation for generations of security and purpose. But more than the money or recognition, what mattered was the lesson his granddaughters had learned, that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they chose courage over comfort, principle over expedience, and justice over personal gain. "I love you girls," Xavier said, encompassing his daughter and granddaughters in his gaze. "And I'm proud of the family we've become." "We love you too, Grandpa," Ella replied. "And tomorrow, can we start planning the next case for the foundation?" Miss Margaret said there's a family in Oklahoma whose great-grandfather invented something important that got stolen, too. Xavier laughed, recognizing in his granddaughter's eagerness the same passion for justice that had driven their fight for Thaddeus Washington. "Tomorrow," he promised. "But tonight, let's just be grateful for everything we've accomplished and everyone we have with us." Asterisk as the family settled into comfortable silence, watching the desert night claim the day. Xavier Robinson understood that their victory was complete, not because they won money or recognition, but because they'd proven that love and principle could triumph over fear and greed. They'd honored the memory of a man who'd been forgotten by history, redeemed the legacy of a family member who'd lost his way, and created a foundation for fighting injustice that would outlast their own lives. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like earthbound stars, marking a small town that had learned to embrace the truth about its history rather than hide from it. And in the house behind them, the documents that had started, everything remained carefully preserved, not as evidence for a lawsuit anymore, but as reminders that some stories are too important to let die, no matter how long it takes to tell them properly. 5 years later, Xavier Robinson stood in the same spot where he'd first discovered his father's hidden documents. But the world around him had transformed beyond recognition. The former gas station had become the Thaddeus Washington Center for Innovation and Justice, a gleaming facility that attracted visitors from around the world, who came to learn about the brilliant inventor whose story had once been buried by greed and prejudice. The center housed not only a museum dedicated to Washington's life and innovations, but also the headquarters of the foundation that had grown into a major force for historical justice across the United States. In 5 years, the Washington Robinson Foundation had helped recover over $2 billion in stolen wealth for families who'd been cheated by systematic discrimination, while establishing legal precedents that made it easier for victims of historical injustice to seek redress in courts. Ella, now 15, had developed into a mechanical prodigy whose understanding of engineering principles amazed university professors who'd begun recruiting her for early admission programs. She'd chosen to spend her summer working as an intern at the center, helping to design interactive exhibits that made Washington's innovations accessible to visitors of all ages. "Grandpa," she called out from across the museum floor, where she was adjusting the settings on a working model of Washington's revolutionary drilling system. "Dr. Martinez from MIT is here for the scholarship interview." Xavier smiled, watching his granddaughter move with the confident competence of someone who'd found her calling early in life. The Thaddeus Washington Engineering Scholarship had become one of the most prestigious awards for promising Black students in STEM fields, providing full university funding plus internships at leading technology companies. Elizabeth, now 13, had blossomed into a thoughtful young woman whose struggles with anxiety had been transformed into empathy for others facing similar challenges. She'd convinced Xavier to expand the foundation's mission to include mental health support for families dealing with historical trauma, and she volunteered regularly at the counseling center they'd established in partnership with local healthcare providers. "Grandpa Xavier," came a voice from behind him. "The documentary crew is ready for your interview." Xavier turned to find Marcus Washington, who'd relocated to Millbrook 3 years earlier to serve as the center's director of community outreach. Thaddeus Washington's great-grandnephew had traded his engineering career in Chicago for the more meaningful work of ensuring his ancestors' legacy inspired future generations. Documentary was one of several media projects that had emerged from their story. A major Hollywood studio was developing a feature film about the case, while a prominent author was completing a book that would trace the Washington family's journey from Texas exile to restored dignity. But Xavier remained most proud of the educational materials they developed for schools, ensuring that children across the country would learn about Thaddeus Washington alongside other American inventors and innovators. "Before we do the interview," Xavier said to Marcus, "I want to check on Keisha." His daughter now lived in a comfortable house on the grounds of the center, where she served as coordinator of the foundation's family support services. Her recovery had been steady and remarkable, sustained by meaningful work helping other families navigate the complex challenges of pursuing historical justice cases. She discovered a talent for counseling and had recently completed her certification as a licensed social worker. Xavier found Keisha in her office, reviewing case files for 3 new families who'd contacted the foundation seeking help with land theft cases dating back to the early 1900s. She looked up as he entered, her face showing the peace that had replaced the haunted expression she'd carried for so many years. "How are the Peterson and Williams cases developing?" Xavier asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Stronger than we initially hoped," Keisha replied, her voice carrying the professional confidence she'd built through years of helping others reclaim their stolen legacies. "The Peterson family has documents proving their great-grandfather was cheated out of oil rights in Oklahoma, and the Williams case involves timberland in Oregon that was taken through fraudulent foreclosure. Margaret thinks both families have excellent chances of substantial recovery. And how are you doing with all this success?" Xavier asked gently, still protective of his daughter's hard-won stability. Keisha smiled. "Dad, I wake up every morning grateful to be part of work that matters. 5 years ago, I couldn't imagine a future where I'd be helping people instead of hurting the ones I loved. This foundation gave me a purpose I never thought I'd deserve." That evening, After the documentary interview was complete and the center had closed to visitors, Xavier walked the grounds with his family, as they'd done countless times over the years. The memorial garden they'd planted in Thaddeus Washington's honor was in full bloom, with native Texas wildflowers creating a riot of color against the desert landscape. Dr. Sarah Washington Holmes, now a regular visitor and member of the Foundation's board, had driven down from her new home in Austin for the documentary filming. She walked alongside Ella and Elizabeth, discussing the engineering scholarship recipients and the research projects being funded by Foundation grants. Thaddeus would be overwhelmed by all this, she said, gesturing at the center's buildings and the crowd of staff members who'd gathered for an impromptu barbecue. He never could have imagined that his stolen legacy would become the foundation for helping so many other families. Sometimes the best justice is the kind that ripples outward, Xavier replied, watching Elizabeth help serve food to elderly visitors who'd come to share their own stories of historical injustice. One person's victory becomes the foundation for everyone else's hope. As the sun set over the West Texas desert, painting the sky in the familiar palette of oranges and purples that had marked so many important moments in their journey, Xavier reflected on the improbable transformation of their lives. They'd begun as three broken people seeking refuge in a forgotten corner of Texas, and they'd become leaders in a movement that was reshaping how America confronted its history of systematic injustice. The money had been life-changing, certainly. Financial security had eliminated the anxiety that had defined their previous existence, while providing resources for education, healthcare, and meaningful work. But the true victory had been something more valuable than wealth: the restoration of dignity to a man who'd been erased from history, and the creation of a legacy that would help other families reclaim their own stolen stories. "Grandpa," Ella said, joining him as the gathering began to wind down. "Miss Margaret called today about a case in South Carolina, a family whose ancestor invented a cotton processing system that was stolen in the 1890s. She thinks it could be even bigger than our case." Xavier smiled at his granddaughter's enthusiasm for the next fight, recognizing in her the same passion for justice that had driven their original quest. "What do you think we should tell them?" "I think we should tell them that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied," Ella replied with the confidence of someone who'd learned that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they chose to fight for what was right. And that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that take generations to win. As Xavier looked around at his family, his recovered daughter, his brilliant granddaughters, and the extended community of people committed to fighting historical injustice, he understood that their story had become something larger than any of them had imagined. They'd proven that love and principle could triumph over fear and greed, that forgotten people could be remembered, and that the arc of history, while long, could indeed be bent toward justice by those brave enough to grab hold and pull. Sometimes, life strips away everything you thought mattered, Xavier reflected, remembering the words that had begun their journey. But sometimes, if you're brave enough to look beneath what seems broken, you discover that the most important treasures were there all along, waiting for someone with the courage to bring them into the light.